This track is focused on farm and sea to market. And what we're looking at is trying to change the current conditions, which have to do with main food serving institutions and retail outlets sourcing a majority of their raw and value added products outside of the state and region. And we're seeing, as many of you know, farmers and fishermen continuing, many of them, to struggle to financially thrive. And what we'd like to see happen is main institutions and retail outlets source the majority of their food from local and regional producers, and the ability to see farmers and fishermen really thrive. So that's what we're working towards in this track. And we're going to be in the breakouts, as Annie suggested, we're going to be talking through some specific activities that are linked to a set of priorities. And I'm going to move to the next slide. So I think, do we have that link in the chat? Let's see.
Yeah, I just put it
Steph,
in.
you just put that. Awesome, thank you. So what we see on this slide are the 3 top priorities that surfaced in the first session. So those of you who were at that session will recall we did some voting after those breakouts to try to determine which areas folks wanted to focus on. And the 3 areas that came up were local incentives, processing infrastructure, training and technical assistance with local product. And we'll talk just in a minute about those in just a bit more detail. You can see the link in your chat, which will take you to a spread. You can indicate which of these priorities you may want to work on in the breakout that will be coming up later this morning. So a little bit more detail on these. The local incentives priority has to do with financial and policy incentives for local purchasing geared towards institutions. So the folks participating in that particular breakout will be looking at activities that support that area. The second priority had to do with processing infrastructure, including aggregation and storage. And again, if you choose to work in this priority area, these are the types of activities that you're going to be trying to generate that would support expanding this. And then the last priority had to do with training and technical assistance, including things like promotion, marketing, and networking support. And some examples of the types of activities that this priority might support would include, like expanding seafood usage and storage, helping folks locate local product, businesses trying to budgeting, seasonal menu planning, motion, and expanding light processing. So again, if you see that link in your chat, you'll have a little bit of time to get into that document, think about which area you want to work on and sign up for it there. And then just a quick review. So as you all know, there's a couple other tracks during the convergence. Track B, which is focused, and I'm blanking on the name of each of these. And I don't know if any of my partners have that right in front of me, but more focused on climate. Annie, you're unmuting.
Well, it's just kind of track B is really about increasing equity and resiliency while increasing production in the food system.
Thank you for summarizing that clearly. So similar to track A, each of those other 2 tracks also came up with priorities during the first session. And for track B, the 3 that they were focused on were improving equity, especially around land and water rights and access, climate resilience and adaptation in fishing, farming, and local food supply, and building bridges, specifically between tribal and regenerative ag communities. And then in track C, which was focused on food security, the areas that rose to the top had to do with advocating for consumer economic empowerment, addressing infrastructure barriers, including things like transportation, and looking at food apartheid and where there's areas where folks don't have access to fresh food, and developing partnerships between local producers and fishermen and organizations and institutions to increase access points and distribution centers. And with that, again, get into that link in your chat and choose which area you want to work on. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Simon, who's with us today, Maine Farmland Trust. She's going to be talking about a project that she's working on, and we're also going to be joined by Sarah Alexander, who's the Executive Director from MOFGA, and Catherine Bessie, who's with the Cooperative Development Institute. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah. And Sarah, I understand that you might need to share your screen. So if that's the case, just let me know and I'll shut mine off.
Great. I will share my screen. I might be able to do that anyway. Is everyone seeing that? Great. Okay.
Yep.
Wonderful. And thank you so much.
Sarah, oh, there you go. Okay, sorry.
Okay, good. Yes, let me know if there are any technical issues. And thank you so much to the organizers of the Convergence. I know that Sarah Alexander and I both really value this opportunity to share the work that we're doing and to collaborate with so many of you. We think it's so important and vital. And so we're just going to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the more immediate changes we've seen in the food system through the pandemic, and a project that we're developing in 2021 that will hopefully provide some of the information that can allow us to more effectively advocate for changes in policy and new initiatives by people who are here that will make the changes that are described in the priority areas that you all have developed. So I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about some of the emergency response and things that we've learned from the pandemic. And then I'll turn it over to Sarah Alexander from MOFGA to talk more about this research project that we're going to be working on in 2021 and to invite all of your collaboration. So as we know, a lot has been changing and moving and shifting in the local food system throughout the pandemic. On the consumer side, we've seen some great surveys from Forager and Hannaford and others that have really shown the changes that I think many of us have experienced in our daily lives. Obviously, food insecurity is on the rise for many, many people. About a 10% increase is projected in the state of Maine in the next year. And at the same time, the ways that people who are accessing food are changing dramatically. So people during the pandemic have been much more reluctant to go to places like large grocery stores and more inclined to visit farm stands or become CSA members, and of course, to buy online. I'm going to share now some results from a survey as well as that was conducted by many of the partners on the screen, as well as the project that we'll be undertaking next. And those collaborators are MOFGA, Cooperative Development Institute, Coastal Enterprises, and University of Maine Cooperative Extension really helped us with the survey that gave us a lot of the grounding and the data that we've gathered so far on the effects on farmers throughout the pandemic. So we saw that while some producers throughout the course of COVID-19 have lost sales, and we see that very tall gray line at the left side of the chart, some have actually improved their sales. That's really happened through direct consumer sales. So that big orange bar on the left here shows that wholesale mostly decreased. And of course, we know that restaurants have been closed, institutions have been closed, so that's fairly intuitive. But among those farmers selling direct to consumer, we've seen more of an even split. And in fact, some more growers than not have seen an increase in sales. There have been a lot of new sales channels in response to COVID-19. So online sales have really increased. Growers are also doing more direct marketing to consumers and more collaborative marketing, although we have not seen as much of a growth in wholesale. So this sort of confirms what I think a lot of us are experiencing, whether we farm or work with farmers or simply eat. There's been a real shift in the way that people access food. And that's come with a lot of challenges for farmers, but also a lot of opportunity that farmers have been resilient enough to take advantage of and to grow their businesses. And that resilience has been supported by many, many entities throughout the state. MFT and MOFGA, as one small piece of that, have provided emergency grants, which gave us an avenue not only to support farms, but to also learn what their experience has been throughout the pandemic. So we awarded just shy of $200,000, a large chunk of that in May, the remainder about a quarter in December of this year, 214 farms total throughout the state. And there's a list of our funders, many of whom are really supporting food systems work throughout our state in so many ways, to acknowledge and appreciate the contributions that they made. And 100% of the funds that we raised were granted out. We changed the eligibility between those two grant cycles. So first, we looked to award grants to farmers that participated in MOFGA and MFT programs. In December, we added beginning farmers to that eligibility. group because we knew that many of them may not have had the chance to participate in programs, but in fact, the pandemic made it extremely hard for farms that were trying to get started to start in this year of all years. So we did see 34 beginning farmers apply and receive some funds in December. What we heard from growers in May reflects a lot of what we saw in the survey. So in broad strokes, there was a huge surge in demand for local food. We did lose a lot of wholesale and agritourism channels. In fact, in May, there was a lot of fear that those channels would be gone entirely, which does not seem to have been the case. There were a lot of expenses and supply chain issues related to acquiring personal protective equipment, new product packaging, and ensuring worker and food safety. One grower shared that they had spent $1,500 on PPE by March and expected to order more in the same amount in May of last year. There was also a lot of delays in hiring needed help on the farm. Many farmers rely on workers that often share housing, and it became extremely challenging to figure out how to share bathroom space and basic living facilities when that was typically the model for supporting employees on the farm. There was a huge shift to online sales and orders, which was both, I think, a blessing in that there was an opportunity to sell that way, and a challenge for growers who are now facing fees for online stores, as well as credit card processing fees that many had been able to avoid by using cash primarily. Childcare challenges, as for everyone, were a huge issue for growers, and the uncertain availability of financial assistance was very unclear at the time in May whether any federal or state relief programs would be available to farms, and particularly to small farms, as we are mainly have in Maine. The first coronavirus food assistance program from the USDA really didn't work for a lot of small diversified farms and was much more easily used by the larger monocropping farms that are in other parts of the country. Finally, a lot of growers pivoted to new business models. So even in May, many had already made a huge shift to direct consumer sales. The biggest thing, of course, is uncertainty, which is still with us in so many ways. Some growers were even doing quite well in May, and whatever product they had, they were able to shift into farm stand sales or direct consumer sales. But the lack of history and the uncertainty was a very intense fear that many growers had in May, and of course are still experiencing. In December, a lot had changed, and those changes continue to affect the food system and ripple out even now. The uncertain availability of state and federal relief programs had been addressed by some fairly effective programs, like a second round of the coronavirus food assistance program, which relied on prior year sales, and it provided growers with a percentage of those sales through a fairly easy, for the most part, not too cumbersome application program. The Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry in Maine was able to allocate a significant chunk of CARES Act funding and provide economic recovery grants that really helped farmers. Many farms were able to make a successful pivot to direct consumer sales and grow that portion of their sales. And the relatively low COVID case numbers in Maine did allow some restaurants to reopen. And so there were more wholesale sales than growers anticipated back in May when we awarded the first round of grants. We did see an ongoing need for beginning farmers. Many farms had planned for growth that they weren't able to achieve. And in particular, those growers who were on a growth trajectory weren't able to take as much advantage of some of the federal aid because their prior year sales may have been significantly lower since they were planning to grow in 2020. And so whatever aid they received may have been based on a much smaller business than the one that they had intended to grow last year. And of course, there's the mental health load of all of this, the difficulties of remaining resilient and making huge changes in the middle of a very challenging circumstance for all of us. So this quote from a grower describes what it's like to navigate that uncertainty, and in particular, to let go of the farm-to-table restaurants that have been such a huge supporter of farms in our state, but for the most part were less available to growers in the last year. And this is, I think, a very hopeful and optimistic view that the change that's happening could lead to even closer relationships between farms and consumers. So that's some of the background of what we have seen throughout this year. And throughout the pandemic, leadership at MFT, MOFGA, Coastal Enterprises, and the Cooperative Development Institute have been meeting regularly to discuss these changes and how we can learn from what's happening to make further needed changes in the food system. So I will turn over now to Sarah Alexander, who's going to share a little bit about how we're planning to build on what we've learned in the last year to learn more in the coming year and to try and help support the food system through the next phase of changes that are on the horizon.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And yeah, that importance of collaboration is in there. We actually, all of those organizations have collaborated in many ways over the years, but we began a concentrated collaboration effort in January of 2020. So before the pandemic even started, and having that foundation of regular meetings between the leadership of MAFCA, MFT, Cooperative Development Institute, and Coastal Enterprises Institute helped us to really address issues as they started to come up during the pandemic. And as we've met regularly over the last year to discuss, where is this going? We have all these questions that are still unanswered. And as we have all been working towards resiliency in the food system, there's this primary question of, is our food system more resilient today? Now that we're 11 months into the pandemic, a lot of pivots have happened, a lot of shifts have changed how consumers are getting their food and where markets are. And so we decided to undertake this research project that we had been in formulation, that thankfully the Sewell Foundation has stepped up to fund this collaborative effort between the 4 organizations. And we're really going to be focusing on what have we learned during the last 11 months of the pandemic about our food system. And we're trying to answer the questions around what pivots that have been made will stick, or should we continue to support? What pivots might go away? And will consumers continue to buy local food when the pandemic ends? So we know that there's been a lot of emphasis, a lot of changes, and we're not, while the light is hopefully at the end of the tunnel, we are not there yet. And so we're probably looking at another growing season of still dealing with the same pandemic issues. But hopefully we can find something out of this that will give us information for what to look at for the future. So that brings us to the specific project, which is a market access landscape analysis. So we want to look at the impacts of the pandemic on consumers, farmers, and wholesale buyers specifically. I included this little graphic. This is from the Vermont Farm to Plate Food Systems, but it's such a beautiful, fully encapsulating graphic of, I think, exactly what we're all here working on. And we're not going to cover every single one of these aspects in the research project. We just don't have the scope, but we're going to look at the produce or the production side, the access side, and the consumer side. So research is being undertaken collaboratively by the 4 organizations in the first half of this year to look at consumers, farmers, and wholesale buyers. And this is really to help inform long-term transformation in the food system, because our assumptions include that our food system will continue to experience disruptions from climate change, pandemics, natural disasters, and we must build a more resilient food system with locally produced food getting to local consumers. Let me go to the next slide. So what we're hoping on the project outcomes is that we're going to have food system data that can be shared with all of you, with service providers throughout Maine and New England. We know that we have a regional food system, and while we're specifically looking at Maine in this research project, we know that that will help inform our regional collaborations as well. We're going to issue a report that will be analyzing the data and making recommendations for opportunities to support resilience in the food system. And we're looking to increase collaboration across not only the organizations that are involved in the direct research project itself, but also with other organizations who we hope many of you will join us in this effort, so that we can adapt and change our programs over time and advocate at the federal and the state level for policies that are going to support the changes that need to happen in the food system. So the ways that you all can get involved, if you have a particular interest in research itself or expertise, we would love to have you involved in collaborating in this project. we are specifically seeking collaborators from BIPOC-led organizations in the state. We want to make sure that the representatives of the communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and related food insecurity are involved in the project. And we have some particular pieces that we're working on there, but would love to collaborate more. And then you as individuals can volunteer to help test our survey mechanisms. We're going to have multiple surveys for consumers, farmers, and wholesalers, but we do need help testing each of those before we release them to their intended audiences. So if you'd like to help with that, we'd love that. And then we also need help spreading the word in your networks to increase survey participation so that we can get a really good cross-section of all of these different audiences to make sure that we're going to get data that's going to be useful to all of us. And I can put our emails in the chat as well, so you all have easy access to them, but you can reach out to any of us if you're interested in collaborating or getting more involved. And I'll stop there.
Thank you again for this time, and we'll put the emails in the chat so that all of you can reach out to us if you'd like to be involved.
Thank you so much, both of you, for showing up. And I feel like this project is such a good example of the type of collaboration that we're really encouraging through the convergence. I wanted to also give folks a chance, if anyone does want to ask a question to Sarah, if you would like to put it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask a question.
I have a burning question. My name is Hannah Semler. I'm the CEO of Farm Drop, but I also do work nationally. And I am co-host of a podcast called What is American Food? And we're researching sort of how national food systems and local food systems and sort of the story of how food gets to our table. And one of the things that has been brought to my attention over the course of this exploration of what is American food is that 84% of our fresh produce in the US in the winter months comes from Mexico. And a lot of that you can find at our local food co-ops. And I was wondering if there were any potentials to include in the research an economic impact assessment of that product that makes consumers go through a food co-op's doors, even if it's like a fair trade, tomato that's coming in from Mexico. If there's a way to understand what the economic opportunity is of filling that space, or in some ways substituting that product with local product versus maybe it being okay for some of that product, just to include that sort of broader international supply chain into the local food conversation. That's for Sarah.
I'm not sure which Sarah, but I'll take a first pass at it, and then Sarah can hop in as well. So the international scope is a little bit outside of this research project. We're keeping it pretty focused on Maine and specifically just those 3 sectors. But I think that's an interesting point. And Matt Chin last week was talking about how if we're gonna promote local products, we need to be able to tell the story of it may cost more, or it may, I guess, be a little more expensive for consumers to buy, but what are the other impacts? How far did it have to travel? Was it produced ecologically? Were farm workers paid fairly? That there are other impacts that are involved in food that's coming from outside of our area or outside of our region. And I think that that's going to be ongoing work that we'll have to do collectively.
Yeah, I would just add that I think a lot of our project is in a sort of deeper level thinking about resilience and what that means. And I would say we're trying to go into it in the spirit of not knowing what the outcome is like before we dive in. So figuring out what farmers and buyers are doing and how we can amplify and support what they're doing. And I think there is a role for the larger international and national food system in a resilient food system, which is more maybe controversial than it might sound, given the fact that we all find bananas in the grocery store every day. But I think that's something that I hope we'll scratch at a little bit, simply by finding out where local farms see the opportunities for their businesses to grow, which I certainly think is in those winter production and the winter months. but trying to see the big picture and how it all fits together, because I don't think we're going to get rid of bananas in the grocery store. You know, I picked those because I really like bananas, but I think it's figuring out how the pieces fit together and what resilience really means in the local food system without going in knowing, for example, even though our organizations, of course, have a clear viewpoint that it's going to look a certain way. We really want to hear that from the people that we're contacting, what they see as the future.
Steph, do we have time for more questions, or should we move to the next section?
We
I've got
do.
a question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sure, Paul.
This question is to either of the Sarahs that made this really great presentation. And it's about, there was a slide that expressed from the farmer's point of view that they've become quite reliable with restaurants and other local sources as customers for their produce. And the question was, you know, what other options, whether it's online sales or others, are reliably replacing those. In Lincoln County, it's a small county by population and size, and also by number of farms that actually have a adequate size to get into a position for their sales. Do you think, is there anything from your initial research that suggests that markets for farms and then springboarding that towards food security subjects need to get outside of county designations, county boundaries, and create a market definition that allows for services coming? Simple example here is we have farms that come from outside of Lincoln County and attend and are important contributors at our farmers markets.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak a little bit since I put that quote in there, and that was a direct quote from a farmer who applied for an emergency grant. A lot of these applications were full of this kind of really quite deep reflection on the pandemic's impacts. And you know, we didn't ask people to you know, share their whole philosophy behind farming, but it's just what came out. And there was a lot of really meaningful stories about the changes people were making. As I mentioned, I think a lot of the opportunity that growers were seeing who were moving away from restaurants was in direct consumer sales and bringing people to their farm. We had a few people who had always wanted to rely on a farm stand as a big part of their business, but had never quite had the consumer traction, enough people stopping by and buying to really make that a big part of their business. And that changed a lot in the pandemic. So that was the area of growth that we were really seeing. As to the last part of your question, which I think, and please correct me if I've got this wrong, or maybe Sarah Alexander will jump in if she had some thoughts on this. The question about what I heard you asking was, what is really local and how do we define it and why does that matter? And I think that's such a great question because so many USDA programs, for example, rely on state boundaries such that for school food purchasing, and I know we have a lot of people in that sector here, something that, for example, you know, comes from New York State at that narrow point of New York City, but is from upstate New York would count as local, whereas something from New Jersey and Pennsylvania, which are also right there, maybe even closer to New York City, would not. So my feeling is that those boundaries don't really serve us well when we're thinking about the local food system, that it should be really about proximity and relationships. But I think there is room for lots of different businesses moving their product in different ways. And I think it's very exciting that farms that wanted to really work in their local community were able to do so in the pandemic. And that's a really positive outcome that we've seen. But I also think there is room for more farms that want to move product further distances and figuring out ways to do that that don't have the same carbon emissions issues and the same consolidation challenges that happen once distributors and larger companies get involved. So feel free to jump in if you want to add to that part of the question. And of course, Sarah probably has some thoughts to add as well.
Yeah, I'll just add one piece, which is just adding the lens of scale, which I think is important to talk about here. So most of the farms that we were really working to support through the Maine Farm Emergency Grants were on the smaller to medium size scale. And those are the farms that were nimble enough to be able to make those pivots quickly. You know, when we look at large scale potato farmers in Aroostook County, they were not able to sell direct to consumer in the same ways. You know, they were able to try to move products through other channels, but the flexibility in the food system gets tighter and tighter the larger the scale gets. And that's the problem with much of our food system, is that it's based on really large scale on that national and international piece. So as we grow, you know, continue to grow resiliency in the local food system, we also need to think about, you know, how are we building, or can we build flexibility in that large scale sector as well? And that's where I think, you know, the local is obviously very important. That's the gold standard. The ideal is that we want people to have good, nutritionally dense, healthy, affordable, available year-round food from their local community. But how do we then expand that out regionally? Most of the growth in sales that we see in New England, for example, organic sales increased 15% in New England over 2020. The top crops were greens, berries, potatoes, and apples. Now we grow all of those things in Maine, but I can guarantee you most of the increase in that production probably came from California and from internationally. So there's definitely a lot to consider and think about here for how we make our food system more resilient.
Thank you, Sarah. And this is a great discussion. There's probably more that we could add to this, and I encourage you all to dig into this a little bit more too in the breakout sessions. It was really great to have information on that project. I'm going to move us along and turn over the next section to Ken Morse, who's with us today to talk about policy. And he's going to go through a couple of slides. Ken, just tell me if you have a slide that you want me to move ahead on, if there's more than one. And with that, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Tell us more.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's really great to hear about that project. And I am very interested in the fact that it aims towards some policy work at the end of the process. So I'd certainly like to help out the best I can. So yeah, I'm Ken Morse. I live in Norway, and I've been mostly involved with Farm to School, Farm to Institution, and over the last 10 years with the network of community food councils. About 2 years ago, when there were changes in Augusta that made it look like there could be more opportunities for good policy work, some of us tried to figure out what bills there were, what was going on, and we found it very difficult to figure out what bills were out there. We've heard of some through our various partners, but we didn't have too much luck. So at that point, through the Maine Farm to Institution, we started the food policy group, and it's been moving forward gradually since then. But in the last since the last election, we've really amped it up somewhat, and so that's my primary job now, is to coordinate the food policy work group. And policy is important because it's a way to translate our values into action with public support. The food councils in Maine decided early on to primarily call themselves community food councils. Across the country, they're generally called food policy councils. And I think maybe it was partly because Maine is so rural, and many of the councils are in rural areas. I always tend to think when you crowd people together in cities, you need more rules and policies. But here it is 10 years later, and the councils have been growing and expanding their work, and more and more attention is being paid to policy work at different levels, at the local level and at the state level, and to some degree at the federal level. Of course, policy is also important to school boards and a lot of other groups too, but we're mostly focused on public policy at this point. So we see it as a way to kind of create the communications and advocacy framework so that more and more of us can be involved in moving good food policy forward in support of some of the sort of vision that the Convergence has laid out and that was just discussed by the last folks. The work group has folks from a bunch of different organizations, and so it's a networking group that really is critical, because just by oneself, it's really hard to look at all the bills. This year there were about 2,000 bills turned in by legislators in December. We've gone through and identified about 100 of those, but even the ones we've identified, it's hard to know unless we're talking to folks at MFCP or CEI or Good Shepherd Food Bank or Full Plates, Full Potentials, that which of the bills are really important. So that engagement of folks has been really important to building the work group. We're now putting out a newsletter every week. The process of submitting bills and then getting them out into the open in the legislature is a bit challenging, because bills all go through the revisor's office, all 2,000 of them, and where they work on making the language appropriate for being a legal document. And so of the 100 bills we're tracking, probably only about maybe 20% of them have come out of that. And until it comes out, it's really hard to do much tracking to tell for sure what committee it's gone to, and when the hearings are going to be, that sort of thing. But that's starting to happen more and more. So we're doing the newsletter every week now. Hopefully each one of you got the newsletter. If you'd like to continue to get it, and we'd like you to do that, because then we have a pool of folks that can be advocates to step up, that we can reach out to, or our partners can reach out to, in support of bills. Now, some of the bills are already moving forward. One of MFCP's premier bills is the Healthy Soils Bill, and I think there was a hearing this morning, or is a hearing this morning, for it. So gradually things are starting to heat up. And like I said, there was 100 food-related bills. There were bills, farm to school, bunch on hunger, nutrition, food banks, food stamps, food sovereignty, various processing bills, healthy soils, like I mentioned, water-related bills, pesticides, herbicides, pest management, waste management, landfills, recycling, plastics, marine resources, fishing, lobsters, working waterfronts, restaurants, minimum wage, green banks, financing, indigenous relations, and then also bills on climate action and economic recovery, which overlap with food systems work. So there is a lot of, there's a lot going on, and part of what the work group is trying to do is make that more accessible to folks so that they can advocate for things that they think are a good idea. And, you know, over time, hopefully we can pull together folks that will help decide which ones are the most important and which ones we favor. We've done a little bit of that already. And in your resource packet, there is a spreadsheet with all those 100 bills and with information about the sponsors and the LD numbers and links to PDF and that sort of thing. And that will continue to grow. The other thing I wanted to share is what you all can do, especially as part of the convergence, but beyond too. And I'm just going to walk through that and then go back to touching on these key bills. Hopefully you'll all sign up for the newsletter. I sent the first 2 issues out yesterday, and when I checked this morning, 72 of you had signed up. So so it is an opt-in thing. We need to have folks opt in. So I hope if you haven't opted in, you will. That we go into a fair amount of detail about the process and about key bills there. The other thing, like I said, is this is a networking project. So the more you and your groups contribute, not only receive the newsletter, but get in touch with bills that are really important to you, then that helps us to focus on those bills and to decide which ones to track on. Now during the convergence, we'll be sharing some of the bills that we're hot to trot on right now, that hearings are happening or whatever. So and that's, like I said, the Healthy Soils Program bill was in a hearing this morning, and there are some hearings already happening, not too many, but some. And so that's why we're doing the weekly newsletter. And if the more folks can send us information so that we can keep that as current, I go to a tracking software every morning to see what I can see, what's come out, and until it comes out and is published, it's hard to do much tracking on it. But during the convergence, the other thing, so there's the immediate work that we're doing, but the other thing is that part of our work here is to identify policy priorities for moving forward. And these may not be things which are currently in front of the legislature, but things we'd like to work with legislators on to get them in front of the legislators. We've had a little bit of discussion about doing something like the Environmental Priorities Coalition, where 35, 40 groups get together to set legislative priorities related to environment every fall before the 2-year session starts, and doing something like moving towards something like that for food system work.
Hey, Ken, I'm sorry, I have the horrible timekeeping job, but we gotta start trying to wrap it up. Sorry.
Okay. So if you all can be listening and be in touch with policy information from your breakout sessions, that'd be good. Otherwise, on this track, you'll see there are 3 bills listed. I don't think any of them have been published yet, so we don't have the LD numbers, but they're really key bills that are related to the priorities of this track. And I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ken. And folks can email Ken for more information. Maybe, Ken, you could put your email in the chat.
Sure.
We're going to take a quick break in a moment. We're running about 10 minutes behind, so we're just going to be very brief. But just a reminder that during the break, if you can sign up for a priority, if you haven't yet, the link is in the chat again. And we'll be coming back in 10 minutes. Is that correct, Steph? Do we want to say 11:20?
Yeah, let's all come back together at 11:20. And in the meantime, we'll put up a lovely piece of local art and play a little music if you do want to hang around for the next 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shelley. It's interesting how a lot of the other priorities are like woven into this priority, of course, because everything's so interconnected. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of this all. So how about the local incentives teams? We've got Bonnie, Katie, then Tanya's groups. So Bonnie, from your and my group, sorry, I had to leave.
Yeah, I think I'm speaking for Bonnie's group. Well, first we talked about a lot of things that were sort of that are working well within the main food system, particularly, and that we sort of don't want to lose. So, you know, the ability of sort of producers to market directly and the attractiveness of that for a subset of consumers, the real power of sort of smaller ecosystems of producers, customers, buyers, and the intricate relationships that have sort of been established in a lot of these sort of, you know, smaller ecosystems within the food system. And I think sort of, so one thought of it, like, how do you incentivize the expansion of that sort of going out, both to sort of reach more people, bring in more producers, also to make sure that you're having accessibility to, you know, those who don't have the financial capacity to necessarily access local food easily. And, you know, we looked at certain things that, again, are already working. You know, some of the great programs like senior farm shares, the double up bucks for SNAP, and like really, I think we need to maintain and increase funding for programs that are working, not just try and sort of create new things. And so really sort of focusing on that. And also, like, I think an emphasis on particularly when it comes to accessibility, how do we keep things simple? And sometimes just looking at ways to directly purchase food products that are being made or grown by producers, and then directly get those to you know, sort of users vis-a-vis food banks or food pantries or other programs that are already existing. And somehow sometimes that can have a lot more power and reach than trying to, you know, incentivize things in a more complicated way. So again, just the power of just sort of find the money, dedicate the money to directly purchasing things. And then I think on another level, we did talk about how to incentivize sort of, or sort of how to create the need for creating sort of newer marketing and distribution channels and entities that perhaps can, again, not necessarily can take a number of smaller farms and really feeling like the smaller farms are a real strength. And it's also where a lot of new farmers want to be, and sort of take those smaller farms and better aggregate, have cooperative sort of distribution and sales, so that we can somehow leverage a bunch of small farms to, again, provide increased local supply into the sort of larger users, such as institutions and grocery chains and the like.
All right, just gonna tell you wrap it up. So perfect.
Great, I'm wrapped up.
From Katie's team.
We talked a lot about how incentives start with individual farmers and go up to community and grassroots level, all the way to statewide. And we talked about unifying our thinking around land farming and sea farming. They tend to be kind of siloized in our thinking. Talked about maybe shifting some funds around, like maybe climate funds for promoting local foods. We talked about food core quite a bit, you know, like AmeriCorps, but food core. The thing I think we focused on a lot was schools, engagement with schools, whether it's, you know, what we've all talked about, lunchroom purchases, but then also the education of children, helping children fall in love with real food. We went into amplifying awareness of the connection between locally produced food and climate resiliency. About also education and outreach to individuals who don't tend to buy local food right now, to break down whatever those barriers are. Then we talked a lot about what we thought the state should do, including what Nate said about expanding, I guess, the SNAP incentives is what we thought, but also that agribusiness is so heavily subsidized by federal funding, we thought maybe the state should step up and try to level that playing field a little bit for family scale farmers and fishers.
Joe, you got about 10 more seconds, sorry.
And commit to purchasing a percentage of Maine foods as a state.
Thank you. We got to move this along, so we let you all off at 1 o'clock. So Tanya's team, if you could just do for 1 minute. Sorry.
Yeah, time's up. Just kidding.
So cruel. All right. So we talked about the local produce fund and some changes that might happen around that. I think not entire clarity around that, but just an opportunity there. We talked about incentives for using electric distribution vehicles for distribution. We talked a little bit about the benefits that we might be able to see for schools if they had some better tracking software and procedures for tracking local procurement. And we talked about branding and just the fact that there's a lot of different labels around different types of products and trying to get like a main brand that was really consistent across the state and across products, and a whole lot of other things. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tanya. So we're moving into the training and technical assistance priority. We'll have Lisa and Peter's group go first just for 1 minute. Go.
Hello. Okay, quickly. This is Lori and I'll present for Lisa and Peter's group. One thing that we spoke about a lot were educators that could educate for culturally appropriate foods in institutions, and also on the other end, educating about healthy foods, which set up an interesting idea that there could be a lot of job opportunities created to build these educational solutions. And then there were tech products that could also build a bridge between the producer and the institution. So that was an opportunity. There was also a mention about barriers to local producers. For instance, the HACCP requirements for local producers that could be addressed and changed. And moving, what was that? 5 seconds. Okay, moving priorities and initiatives forward with Indigenous leadership.
Beautiful, thank you. A lot of crossover with track B too. Amara's group, you got 1 minute.
Okay, that's me. I'm gonna do popcorn style. 51% local. The data needed to inform the production practices, focusing on values, not just local. What are the rights? What are the cultural rights? What is the right to food? Software, bringing together the information and the stories so that it's at our consumers' fingertips, and all of this being involved in a fleet of government and nonprofit and for-profit funded technical assistance warriors out there helping to understand what the needs are for technical assistance at the local level for our local farms. Looking at institutional kitchens, training, and making sure that there are regenerative farming practices, technical assistance available. Specialized farm consulting services. How do we match who the farmers are, what they want to be, what they want to bring to the food system with the economic opportunities and market channels that are most appropriate. Having a cross-sector forum for sharing information that is basically helping to bring all this together. I'll just
thank you. It's very short on time. And Alex's group, the last group, and then we'll close up here.
So we touched on a little bit about consumer education. So using like farm to school for nutrition and food system curriculum integration. We talked about technical assistance around logistics efficiency with maybe processing and distribution. We talked a lot about public policy around certification, traceability, labeling, like local labeling, and also technical assistance around consumer education around where their food comes from, et cetera. And then marketing related to that. And then support for the sectors around like training through CTE and career pathways and really healthcare access for all workers.
Nice, thank you. I can't spend time thanking you all, but just know we really, really appreciate your deep engagement here. We're going to be collating the Jamboard activities. Volunteers will be doing that over the next few days. We're not going to pass you on another survey about the activities to weigh in. Your track team A are well suited to do that from all of your input in the Jamboards. So that's going to be preparing for session 3. And then we will, in session 3, really just look at the activities that have been chosen and discuss how we can move these forward the best way possible with the framework of, the activities will be decided on within the framework of also what centers equity and climate the best and what resources do we have to move these forward. So with that said, I am going to pass on our closing to Jonah, and we'll see you next week.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for sharing. I'm feeling inspired by what everyone shared and getting to meet folks, connect with folks I've known, and just, really excited by this convergence, this weaving together of our collective networks and energy and ideas. And, there's a lot we're sharing, and I'm excited for what will come after this. This is not the end. This is a point of growth and emergence for us together. And so I'm excited to continue to be exploring this with you next week at our final session of this track, but knowing that these conversations will be ongoing. I want to just encourage folks to, continue these conversations, reach out to folks, use the Slack channel, do the network maps, et cetera, to really continue the conversations forward. I just want to close with a quote from Carissa Lewis, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Third World Organizing. In nature, everything works in collaboration. There are hummingbirds and flowers that are in such deep coordination, they need each other for survival. How vibrant and alive and successful could our movements be if we moved with such coordination and collaboration? I'll leave that with you today. Thank you again, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Jonah. Thanks, everybody.